very much for inviting me tonight. Delighted to join all of you. And I'm going to spend a bit of time this evening talking about social mobility. It's something that I'm really dedicating myself to now. It's part of my journey in life, and I think if I'm trying to accomplish anything tonight, it's probably to give you a sense almost of the history of Britain and why social mobility has never been something that we've had, but it's time that we did. And I think maybe to give you a sense that actually yours is a generation that can really make a difference to Britain, and if you can be even remotely as activist on people and social mobility, equality of opportunity as you've been on planet, then you really do, I think, have a chance to shape the future of this country in a way that will be transformational for generations ahead of you. So I'm going to take us right back, 370 odd years, to, I think, the time when we really had our first debate on equality of opportunity. And it came in my constituency, actually, of Putney, in southwest London, and it came towards the end of the English Civil War. It's 1647. Effectively, it's clear that Parliament and the army have won the Civil War, and that Charles I is going to have to do some kind of deal. And so there's a debate about what happens next, effectively. And it's also a debate that is contested because there are many in the army who are worried that they're about to get sold out by maybe their generals. They're worried that having done this fighting, that maybe somebody is going to come and say, right, first of all, we are going to have peace, but we're going to make sure that army gets sorted out. We don't want them rocking the boat too much. So there's actually quite a lot of agitation in the army. Some of it's also a bit of a culture wars. There's a bit of a religious culture wars going on in Britain as well. There's all sorts of drivers for it. But at any rate, there's a real problem to be fixed between Parliament and the army and getting some kind of a consensus. And so they end up having something called the Putney debates. And it takes place in October in 1647. And most of Oliver Cromwell's generals are sat to listen to the case made by the army to them for what they want now. But actually, it's not universal. There are some senior members of the army, the generals, who make the case for the army. And one of those people is a man called Thomas Rainsborough. And they get on with the debate, and it's a debate really about who should have the vote, who has a stake in Britain, and what should it therefore mean in terms of their representation in this Parliament. This Parliament, they literally have just fought, and in many cases died, to preserve its say, rather than having an overwieldy King Charles. And so it's really an argument about the franchise, in other words, who gets to vote. And it's an argument that starts, but actually when you look at the debate they had, it is absolutely mind-blowing in its ambition. And so some of Cromwell's generals are saying, well, actually, we're not going to give every man in the army a vote. Forget it. In fact, Henry Ayrton said it would be anarchy to give everyone the vote. Many argued that surely only people who had property and wealth of a certain amount could really have the chance to have a say in Britain. And actually, when you look at how the sweep of British democracy was to happen after that point, it was to take another 2 centuries, really, before the franchise of who got to vote in this country for our Parliament really opened up. And of course, it was only in the last century that women even got the vote. So all of this, just about men. So let's go back to 1647 then. Bearing in mind, this is the best part of literally 400 years ago in our country. And let's go back to the arguments, not about just who should have the vote, but why. Because this takes us, in a sense, to where we are today. nearly 400 years later, picking up this argument about why people should have a vote. Because Thomas Rainsborough makes an argument that I think is transformational and is important. He makes a vote not just for every man in the army to have a vote, because that's what he wants to see. He explains why he wants that, and he says something, and a phrase that is, if you go into St Mary's Church in Putney today, is etched on a piece of stone. It's above the main archway as you are sat in the church looking out towards what is now the church hall. There's a cafe, of course, it being Putney. They do sell wine. And I did all these public meetings in that place, and not once did I not look at this phrase and get inspiration from it, because for me and for my journey, it resonated so much. And what Thomas Rainsborough said, he was explaining the purpose of democracy, not just who should have the vote, but why it mattered. And he said, his argument was, for the poorest he, that is in England, hath a life to lead as the greatest he. In other words, he was saying, whoever you were in Britain, you had the same chance to have a life and contribution. For the poorest he that is in England hath a life to lead as the greatest he. He was saying that for him, the reason in that case one man, one vote mattered is because he believed it would deliver a version of Britain with equality of opportunity, where you would have the chance to lead a life, whoever you were, not just if you were somebody who was from the more privileged gentry classes. Yet 400 years later, pretty much, we haven't achieved that vision that Thomas Rainsborough set out all the way back then. He set out a purpose for our democracy that I think is right, as it is powerful. And I think now, actually, for Britain, the clock is really ticking. Because actually, we see this as a huge challenge, I think, for our country. It's a country that's never had equality of opportunity. It's probably a country where actually the start you have in life, your background, is more shaping for the life ahead of you than perhaps for many countries. And I'm going to make an argument that that's bad for all of us. But before I do that, I think it's probably worth digging into what we mean by social mobility, maybe some of the myths around it in a way. And let's understand, if you like, what it is, but what it isn't. Because I think only in doing that can you then start to understand its impact, or the lack thereof, on our country. So, first of all, social mobility, equality of opportunity, levelling up, breaking down barriers. Language matters, actually, and I realised this when I was an MP, and sometimes I would end up in a debate with maybe somebody from a different party, and I'd suspect that we both really agreed on equality of opportunity, but I steadily realised that we were disagreeing because we just used different semantics. So I think the first thing I would say is that whether or not you call it social justice, social mobility, breaking down barriers, as I suspect it's going to be called for the next few years, or levelling up, actually doesn't really matter. It really doesn't matter what you call it. I think there is a general consensus that equality of opportunity, irrespective of background, is really important for us to now achieve. We used the phrase when I was at the Department for Education, levelling up. And we used that because I felt at the time that social mobility was a bit think tanky, that people didn't really understand what it meant, and it wasn't really very engaging for people. So we were looking for a phrase that could really convey more emotively and instinctively to people what this would mean to their lives. And I was looking for a phrase that I felt would deal with one of the common myths of social mobility, which is somehow if my life has to get better, that someone else's life has to get worse. Like somehow, if I get an opportunity, that means they don't. I think that's one of the biggest myths around equality of opportunity that we should be absolutely clear on. More people having more opportunities creates more opportunities for all of us. It's absolutely clear. And levelling up, for me, was never about taking away opportunities from people who already had them. That would have been utterly self-defeating. It was about getting more opportunities to people who didn't. I grew up in a part of the country south of here, but Rotherham, just outside Sheffield in South Yorkshire. I knew during the 80s, my dad spent time unemployed. He worked in the steel industry when it was really just collapsing. I knew there were people getting a better start than me. I didn't really know what that looked like, but I sort of had a sense that probably the start I was getting was maybe less good than others. But I never wanted to see someone else have fewer opportunities so that I could have more. So first of all, social mobility and equality of opportunity is not a zero-sum game. And we need to realise that it floats everyone's boats. We all get more opportunity when we free up talent to succeed in our country. That is in all of our interest. I think the second thing I really wanted to talk about was, often we talk about two different kinds of social mobility, and it's worth just, again, setting that out. On the one hand, because you'll hear people say, oh, social mobility's got worse, other people will say social mobility is stagnated. And actually, one of the problems we've got is we don't have great measurement on social mobility. And it's probably one of the reasons why we've failed to make sufficient progress on it. If you don't measure something, it is quite hard to shift it in the right direction. And this is generational. And you can think, going back to climate change, until we were measuring emissions, I don't think people really understood the impact that we were having on the planet. It was only when you had the science measures that you could hold companies to account, for example. But on social mobility, there are broadly two lenses through which you can look at it. The first lens is what's called absolute social mobility. And that's broadly, are more people getting more opportunities over time? And actually, you can probably say there have been periods broadly in Britain's recent history, in a sense, where we can say yes to that. More people getting better opportunities. When you dig into what's driving that, so what's kind of correlating, why is it shifting? Effectively, what comes out of that is Britain, post-war, went through an economic transformation. There were fewer people doing manual jobs, or more people working in offices. So that was part of the shift. There were better quality roles for people. We moved up the value chain, in a sense, as an economy. I think the second thing that's often driven more absolute social mobility is just the economic cycle. And I think we should really understand this, that people from different walks of life shouldn't have to time it right with the economy. For example, when you leave university, to be able to get opportunities. And too much of access to opportunity, particularly for younger generations, is really driven by whether you hit it right on the economic cycle. If you do, and there are lots of jobs being created because things are going well, lucky you. But if you leave university, and it's a tight labour market, and actually there's not a lot of jobs happening, in that case you don't get the opportunity. So absolute social mobility has broadly moved at times in the right direction, but it's been very driven by that broader economic transformation, and it's also been very driven by the economic cycle. The jury is out, really, at best, on absolute social mobility. You can argue that certainly in, I would say, maybe the last 10, 15, 20 years, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that absolute social mobility is particularly driving greater equality of opportunity. The second lens through which you can look at this is relative social mobility. So in other words, what are the odds of me coming from a working class background in Rotherham, well, I guess becoming a cabinet minister, but sort of almost getting out of that strata of socioeconomic background, and how's that changed over time? I think the data on that actually is at best suggesting that we have plateaued for a while. At worst, and in fact there's a growing evidence base that it's now declining, that there maybe was a time when people were sort of shifting up and around and out of, if you like, where they started, but that's less likely to happen now. And actually, if you look at an IFS report that probably came out, I think it was probably October last year, one of the things it points to is that as a result of the 1980s onwards house price rises, actually now wealth inequality drives much more of this perhaps than it did in the past. So for my generation, I was able to get on the housing ladder. I studied really hard. I was the first person in my family to get to university. I became a finance person, trained at PwC, got a good job, and I was able to get onto the housing ladder. I wouldn't have a chance of being able to get on the housing ladder with no family wealth now. So I'd be putting in the same effort, but I wouldn't be getting the rewards if I was your generation today. And I think that's a massive step backwards. So I think that is complicating our ability to drive strong social mobility. And I think you've also just simply got the fact that probably post-COVID maybe there are some broader drags on talent development that have inevitably happened in our economy, and that they will impact people from more disadvantaged backgrounds. I think the final thing to say on this is there's a systemic element of this as well that we should all realise, and it sort of starts to explain why we are where we are today. So systemically, I think we have to understand that there's an accumulation that goes on. So advantage is accumulating, but so is disadvantage. So rightly or wrongly, what you're seeing is intergenerational disadvantage now, much more. And I think even there's evidence now that suggests if you think about social mobility as climbing up a ladder, there are the rungs in the middle that people used to be on, maybe where you weren't working class and maybe you weren't going to be as likely, you weren't going to get trapped there. So if you're in the middle, you had a pretty decent chance of being able to climb up, whereas today the evidence is starting to strongly suggest that even if you're in the middle, you're really having to fight against falling down more, perhaps, than you ever would have done in the past. So all of these challenges, and I think recognising that this is a problem everywhere. So, I was development secretary, but this issue of weak access to opportunity is really now driving a huge amount of what's going on around the world, whether it's our own politics here in the UK, and inequality of opportunity is not just a problem where I grew up in the north, in communities like Rotherham that haven't changed. It's a problem in London. You're not going to get on the housing ladder in London. However talented, however hard you're prepared to work. If you grow up on the Alton estate in my constituency, you're probably literally only about 5 miles from the city, where some of the very best paid careers are in this whole country. You're probably not going to get access to those careers. Those doors are probably disproportionately, if I can put it like that, closed to you. But then when I look at the time I spent in development, effectively, we're now seeing migration being driven not just by conflict, but by people's desperation to get opportunities. And that matters. It's a really human instinct to want to make the most of yourself, to make the most of your talents. I think for your generation, you know, you are people who are literally investing in your future. And I think that's absolutely to be commended. You know, you're putting your money into your talent because you think it's going to help you get on in life. And I think you're right. I think that is a good investment. But what needs to change is a broader country so that the barriers that will too often be there, stopping great talent flowing to opportunities, they need to be removed so that you can really be in a version of Britain where you can absolutely thrive and connect up to brilliant opportunities. So this is a challenge for everywhere. It's about places in some cases. In other cases, it's about people and sections of our community that are often shut out of opportunity. So I'm going to now spend a few minutes talking about almost the impact. Let's kind of dig into how this cascades through our country. But I want to finish on what we can do about this, because we are not impotent. If we want equality of opportunity, it's our choice. And just because Britain has a tradition of inequality of opportunity, that doesn't mean it has to be your tradition, it doesn't have to be my tradition, it doesn't have to be our future. You get to decide what kind of Britain you actually want. So if we don't want today's version, then we can actually collectively get a different version of Britain. And I want to talk about why I think that matters for society, why I think it matters for economy, and I think why I think it matters for our politics as well. So let's kind of dig into society. I've talked about some of the compounding effects, but I think we can all see how fragmenting that growing problem on effort and reward is for everyone. I think it's impossible to accept a country where actually people are literally climbing up, not literally, people are effectively climbing up different ladders. For some, their link between effort and reward is really strong. But for others, it's really hard to see that however hard they work, whether they're really going to be able to ever get where they want to in their lives. And I think when you think about the cost of living challenges and how much of a political debate that is in Britain and the impact inflation's just had on people, one of the reasons it matters is because it's the flip side of weak social mobility, isn't it? It's because it's always the same people who are affected by these economic downturns. It's not because they're not talented, it's because they're stuck where they are. And it's because actually the far smarter version of Britain is one where people could actually be able to climb up into the next job, get the training they needed. They'd be in an employer that would be making sure that happened. It's a different version of Britain where people are much more in control of their own lives and where they want to go, rather than just being wherever they've ended up for the time being. So there are some wider issues, and I think we often hear this phrase, talent spread evenly, but opportunity is not. I think that is absolutely true. And I think it articulates almost two halves of a social mobility strategy for Britain. Talent spread evenly, but not developed consistently. Too often, depending on where you go to school, whether you've got good schools in your area, whether you get the right advice about A-levels, about how to pursue your education, about where to go to university, what to do, what kind of career you might like. And then this sense that opportunity is not spread evenly, which is also true. I remember one of the very first decisions or realisations I had as must have been pretty young. I would have only been about, 10, 11 when I was growing up in Rotherham. And we used to head to see my grandma and granddad. They lived on the other side of town, and I remember coming back one day in the car thinking to myself, I'm not sure I'll be able to do this when I'm older, like my mum and dad, because I'm probably not going to live close to my mum and dad, because I'm going to have to move, because I want to get, my job is going to mean I have to go somewhere else, because there wasn't opportunity. There wasn't opportunity on the doorstep. So part of this is about making sure Britain's talent is developed. Part of this is about that wider system fix to make sure there's more opportunity, higher quality opportunity, and it's fairer opportunity, and it's open opportunity to people. So for society this matters. It's hard to be what you can't see. I'd never met a lawyer when I was growing up in Rotherham. Why would I think being a lawyer is something I could do, I would want to do? There's a whole range of challenges, I think, in practically enabling people in very different communities to understand what's out there. But I think this mantra of talent spread evenly, opportunity is not only a fact. I think it's also, I would argue it's a belief, and you either believe that or you don't. You either believe that really we're a talented country and there's we waste talent on an industrial scale and that needs to be fixed, or you kind of don't. And so for me, in politics, and I think for people thinking of politics, either it's almost a defining principle for how you look at things, or it isn't. And many of you, probably most of you, will go on to leadership roles in some organisation or another. And those of you that succeed will be the ones that believe it, because you will be the ones that actually reach into that wider talent pool, and you will outperform your peers that don't manage to do this. In reaching out beyond people who just look like you to get that broader team, that more diverse team, you will reach better decisions, you will achieve stronger performance outcomes, and you will simply do better. And all of the evidence in business is already there. Businesses that are more diverse achieve stronger returns. I happen to think that's broadly true for society as well. I also think a society with equality of opportunity is more stable than one that isn't. And I would argue, when you look at almost the political volatility here in the UK, and when you look over at a US election, what you're seeing is almost a debate on inequality of opportunity that is now destabilising. The failure to deliver enough opportunity to enough communities is destabilising political systems all over the world, but particularly mature democracies. So that's society. Economically, equality of opportunity it's probably one of the most powerful levers for driving growth that we have. No economy is going to grow if it locks talent out of being able to play a role. I mean, it's literally like saying you've got a car with an engine, obviously a petrol car, where only one of the pistons is firing, and expecting it to perform as well as a car where the whole engine is working effectively. And I think we cannot continue to really expect Britain to do well in the 21st century when our economy is a service sector-driven economy. That's all about talent. The broader economy is shifting to become creative-driven, AI, whatever it is. It's a tech economy. And at the heart of that is talent, it's people. So if we were stood here in the 1980s, it would all be about machines and processors and all. That's then. The economies of the future that succeed will be the ones that are really driving that creative innovation and research and and talent is at the heart of all of that. You can't have tech advances without talent. They go absolutely hand in hand. So for our economy, this is crucial, and I think I've had this conversation with people like Kristalina Georgieva at the IMF and her predecessor. I think digging into this issue of human capital and, in a sense, the difficulties of valuing human capital, I think that's been at the heart of why we found it so hard to make progress on driving social mobility. I think we all understand the value of investing in, research or a new factory. But I think we found it a lot harder to understand that investing in human capital really, really matters. And isn't it utterly ironic, but also bizarre, that you can have the Treasury, for example, invest £900 million, as it did the other day, in artificial intelligence, and that will be on UK PLC's balance sheet. It's down there as an asset. But if we invest 900 million in human intelligence, that would be education, it's classed as a cost. And I think it underlines how, if we're going to be successful in today's world, we have to radically rethink, much more smartly and clear-sightedly, these issues, if we're going to reach good decisions on how we invest a pound of taxpayers' money, whether you are in government or whether you are a CEO running a business. So it gets to the heart, I think, of almost why we've ended up finding this so hard. I think the reality is it's also hidden, let's face it. If I walk into a boardroom, I can see how many women are around the table, but I can't see, if you like, how many people from a low socioeconomic background there. I've got no sense of that. And so if you can't see this, it's been a very hidden problem, I think, for the UK and many, many other countries. I think the final thing I'd say about the economics of social mobility is, I spent time as a Treasury Minister. Britain's numbers increasingly don't add up. We've got a lot of debt as a country after COVID, and the interest on that debt in an era of actually not high interest rates, but certainly higher interest rates, that's a big cost for us. So we've got to find a way as a nation to work out how to get our finances back in shape. And this is one of the big political debates that we are going to embark on. But the reality is that it's lives off track that cost all of us money and mean that lives aren't fulfilled. So actually, if you're going to get out of that vicious cycle of debt and interest means we can't have enough money to spend on this and that, we have to flip that, and we have to find a way to flip that, to be able to get ahead of that problem, to be able to have more early interventions so that we're not wasting money on lives that are off track, and instead we're investing money in keeping lives on track. It's easy to say that. It's really, really hard to do. But on our ability, I think, to be able to confront that and find solutions to that will turn a lot of all of our futures, actually. Because if I'm right that there's this accumulation issue on social mobility, then this thing doesn't just stay steady state. It tends to get worse over time. So we're going to have to actively take a decision to switch that cycle round and to have a generational approach to switching the cycle round, because it doesn't just happen over a few years' time. I think it brings me on to the final piece of this, really, which is the political case for change and doing social mobility. I think we should recognise, and perhaps it's ever more clear. I mean, I'm talking about system change. I'm saying that actually, fundamentally, if you like, the way in which Britain runs, the tracks, if you like, aren't set up right. I'm saying whether it's society and our own expectations, whether it's maybe how Treasury looks at public finance accounting, whether it's the fact that we don't even track socioeconomic background in companies and employers, even though as an education secretary I obsessed over free school meal children outcomes, the attainment gap, we all do, your university does. We have no information when people get into employment. All of that billions and billions and billions of pounds we put into developing talent, looking at disadvantage outcomes, attainment gaps, and then when people get into employment, nothing. We don't know. So there's an economics, but the politics really are that we should recognise that, especially now, we're sort of in a battle of operating systems here, aren't we? Because there are some countries that don't mess around with this democracy rubbish. You know, they're just going to motor ahead without having a voting system that allows people to have their say. They do things differently. But we have a democracy. But I think if I bring it back to where we started, in a sense, Thomas Rainsborough was right. It only really works if it's democracy with a purpose. And I think our problem has been, we've had quite interesting, we're about to have one again, interesting debates about taxes high or low, spending high or low. But in a sense, we've been doing that without actually having a debate about, well, what Britain do we want that spend system or tax system should be generating? What's the point of all of this? And I would argue that the point of it is to deliver equality of opportunity, because in a democracy, that's how you actually really unlock results for everyone. And unless you actually do that, those two things go hand in hand. Unless you do that, then yeah, you will be authoritarian regimes will just motor on ahead, won't they? Because they can. Right, I'm going to talk very briefly, because then we'll finish, about some solutions. There are solutions on this. There are solutions because this is a people problem, and so this can be a people solution. The solutions actually, I think, are bound up in recognising that this is a development problem for the UK. So I was involved in crafting the Sustainable Development Goals when I was Development Secretary. They were obviously predominantly designed with developing countries in mind, but the principles behind them were really sound. So we need to realise that weak social mobility is our development challenge alongside our transition on net zero. It is not just planet, it is people. And we need to realise that this is a country that has shown ambition in the past. As we came out of the Second World War, people put in place a welfare state, they put in place an NHS. At that time, interestingly, if you look, there was also an Education Act called the Butler Act. So we were thinking about, clearly as a country, we were thinking about what can we do to stop lives going wrong? What can we do to keep people healthy? Because that's part of often why lives go wrong. And we were sort of thinking about how can we make sure that lives also go right through education. I think we never really delivered on that third bit of the vision. And I'd argue now it's time, we have to come back to that. We have to find some solutions to it. And I think the good news is that if you look at society, we have been a very divided country, but not on this, actually. When you look at any generation, the stats are very clear. People do want a version of Britain with equality of opportunity. So we're not divided on this. It's probably the only thing we're not divided on, actually. But we're not divided on this. This is a uniter for people across our country. I think when it comes to economics, British business increasingly understands this. A lot of my work is with employers and with businesses that have understood how important this is to them and to their employees and to their business. Like, they know they're not going to succeed unless they reach into that wider talent pool now. And I think even for politics, there is a growing sense across the parties that this now has to be at the top of the agenda. I think the big challenge for politicians is how they can get beyond the colour of their party rosettes to work more collaboratively on this, which is what we will need them to do, a bit like we've seen broadly on climate change, if we're really going to make a change. But a lot of the levers for change are outside of politics, and it's how employers behave, it's what universities like Durham are doing, it's how all of us can work across our communities to really drive change. So I suppose there's a lot more I could say, and I'm going to shut up now. But I really want to give you that sense that this isn't going to fix itself, but also we're not powerless. And if fixing social mobility is one life at a time, then actually that means we can all be part of the solution, which is really good. And I think there was always going to come a time when we were going to have to come back to Thomas Rainsborough and pick up that mission in the sense that he had and make it real. But I genuinely think that time is now. And I think that's really exciting. But it is going to take all of us if we're really going to do this. And I will leave you with this brilliant phrase saying moral in the sense that I came across when I was a development secretary, and it was one that is, I think, said in Africa. It's if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And if we're going to achieve equality of opportunity, we've got to go together. So that's what I think we should do. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine, for that outstanding speech. I now call upon questions from the floor. So can you please state your name and college for the minutes?
What is the impact of social capital on social mobility, and how to address this to achieve true equality of opportunity?
It's a really, really important question. And it's interesting how often the focus on what people are getting out of university is, has it connected you with a job, which does matter. Also, what degree did you get? I would say for me, one of the most, possibly the most important thing I got out of going to university was social capital, was that broader development that I had as a person that took place alongside my continued academic development. I think the problem is that even now, really, in Westminster, I don't think going to university is necessarily seen in that context of being a brilliant way to develop people's social capital. And I also think this is something we were looking at when I was at the DFE. I don't think we have a strategy around what that means. So what are the components of social capital? How would we make sure that we consistently allow people to build them up? And what's the best way to do that? How would we measure, in a sense, that we were making sure that everyone from every background was getting that social capital they needed? But I think we can do that. I tell you what, I could talk a lot more on what I think you could do, but it's a really, really important point. And when you look at employers and what they're looking for, often it's that social capital that they will point to in a way that they see as the difference between many candidates. But they're looking ever more broadly at how they how they see social capital. It's not just about how polished you are. They're looking at whether you've got a track record of bouncing back from challenges, and whether you can work in a team, how creative you are. Then they're sort of looking almost beyond, if you like, that more superficial piece, because they know that they can teach all of that. It's kind of what's inside that they're more interested in these days.
Question.
Go to the back there.
Hi. You mentioned that companies know they're not going to succeed unless they tap into a wider pool with regards to people from different class and social backgrounds. But I was quite curious as to why I'm just curious as to why you believe that there's such a high opportunity cost by companies to hire people from particular social backgrounds rather than others.
As in,
yes.
Explain that a bit more to me.
What real benefit do they get by hiring people from particular social backgrounds when, for the vast majority of work, even high-skilled work, tasks seem pretty fungible, as you pointed out, could be taught to, say, most people with a certain level of education. And the second question I was going to ask is, you talk about putting together this journey of opportunity. I was just curious whether you were supporting or against DEI in particular as a program, because from my understanding, it seems like something that can be easily divisive.
So, I'll probably take two of them both together, because they do go hand in hand, yeah. And again, this is a really important debate. Diversity matters for lots of reasons. It matters for equity and fairness, actually. But I also think it matters for delivering results. I'll give you some totally different examples. An NHS that is really only populated with one bit of society isn't going to have a good sense of how to provide care for what is a really diverse Britain. And so, for example, I can think in my own constituency, for young black males and depression, mental health issues, it's actually really important. I think that was missed because our NHS wasn't sufficiently represented in its workforce by people who understood those issues and, if you like, the solutions of how to craft services in order to address them. So that's one. The second one, I would say, it's just in business. If let's say you're developing products to a wide Joe public, you're not going to be able to do that if you only ever lived in one bit of that community. And that's why you'll just get out-competed by companies that have people who are much more representative, because it doesn't matter what the issue comes up, you'll have people in your team that have an instinctive understanding of probably what some of the solutions are going to be. There's also the fact that actually you don't want everyone agreeing around the table. I think some of the best discussions I've ever had as a Secretary of State is when people have said, well, I don't agree with that, or I've got a different point of view. You want a rich discussion to make sure you've really looked at the sweep of an issue. Why have why have 5 of the same brains on something when you can have 5 really different brains? And everyone knows this in business. And, we work with some of the law firms, and one of them said to us that they'd sent a team of lawyers over to the States to work with the client. And the client had rung up and said, you've sent me 3 of the same person. I'm not paying for that. Literally, it said, I want 3 different viewpoints on our problem. So, again, even if you weren't personally invested in D&I, the reality is if you're running that law firm, you're just not going to win that client again unless you respond to the market that they are. So it's all pushing in the same direction. On that D&I, which is diversity, equality and inclusion, I think it has become a bit tick box, and I think that's a real risk. And I think we saw this a little bit with climate change, didn't we, where you get this greenwashing, and I think the bottom line is either you, as I said, believe that talent spread evenly opportunity is not, or you don't. And this is going to be the challenge on that whole agenda, is if you're not really authentic on it, then yeah, you may well not do it that And the best people want to work for companies that are authentic. I would always want to work in a business where it's stimulating and interesting. I don't want to work in a boring business with one kind of person. So everything, and leading those teams is a skill. So running towards succeeding and thriving in a diverse world is really important, and being able to be a leader that can build that coalition and, if you like, go together. I don't think you're going to get anywhere in a career unless you can demonstrably show that you're able to lead and go together. But, we are a diverse community, so the good news is diversity's out there. We just need to be a bit smarter at how we pull it in authentically. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's exciting.
Can we did follow up with 20 balls.
Okay.
Next question. Snappy.
Martha and Frank Durham Society. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the extent of the effect of private schools on social mobility, and whether or not you support them, or if you support the abolition.
I think if we didn't have private schools, we wouldn't be inventing them today, in a nutshell. That's one way of looking at it. But we do have them. I think the big question is whether and how you make them more open to more people. It's as simple as that. And I think the big question for private schools is, if I'm right about diversity and that you're not going to actually be able to really lead unless you're able to lead really diverse teams, then yeah, they will need that diversity. Otherwise, being candid, they'll be out-competed by great talent that's been to much more diverse schools and got that sense of that diverse version of Britain. Those will be the people that are more credible leaders of the future. So I think everyone's got to change, and I think that's a good thing, and it's something we should embrace. But nobody picks where they start, and very few people pick where they go to school either. So we need to have a really measured debate on all of this. And I think it cannot involve finger pointing and saying you're the problem. We're not going to get anywhere. We really do have to go together. People are from very different walks of life. Nobody chooses their start. I think how we judge people should be on their willingness to make a contribution to equality of opportunity. And so people can start with privilege, but that hopefully means they should understand why opportunity is so important if that's what they've had. It doesn't mean that they're a problem to be fixed, in my view. As I said, that's why levelling up is about levelling up. It's about more people getting the chance to understand and experience how opportunities can help them develop too.
Next question. Let's go, Debbie.
So Reno will be St. Aidan's College. Would you say that the reason for the UK not addressing social mobility as particularly a development issue comes from arrogance, and specifically the narrative that, the UK is a developed country, and so it has no need for approaching its problems in the same way that, say, a developing nation would? And so if you think that this narrative is the problem, how would you suggest that we go about changing it?
I don't think it's an arrogance. I just think we haven't really realised that we're not fully developed ourselves. That's all. It's a change of mindset that we need, you're right. But I think it's a mindset to say that we know for other countries that their progress is multifaceted, that they need to deliver. And I think what I'm saying is that means that we need to have the same mindset for ourselves. And that I'm afraid it might be complicated for politicians, because politicians love to say, I'm going to do this, and that will mean everything's better. I'm going to academise every school. Ergo, education will get better. That could be part of the solution, but there are no simple answers. And so what we've done in our work is break down this challenge of social mobility into 14 key goals. We've come up with 14 goals. Some of them are around education, some of them are the ability to connect to opportunities and progress. Some of them are around these broader barriers that either help or hinder us, whether it's health and well-being, digital divide, entrepreneurship skills. And I think what I'm saying is, and the difficulty is, actually we need to get all of those things shifted. But that's okay, because if everyone actually works on it, we've got different businesses who work on different bits of the challenge. You've got a Durham and the university sector working on some of those bits of the challenge again. The higher education sector has been pushing on social mobility through widening access and participation now for 20 years. So this is a sector that knows a lot about how to level the playing field and open up access to opportunity. So a lot of the answers are out there. We just have to get a lot smarter about finding them. And maybe it's not about arrogance. Maybe it's just being humble about the fact that it's going to take a lot of work, but we can get there.
Next question.
It's about Hatfield College. You talk about opportunity, one of the greatest tools of the country during our, I suppose, golden age of opportunity over the last decade of the 20th century or so was grammar schools. Now, look at Durham University. Reasonable university, still just about. And well, look at members of this House. Myself, President-elect, and many members of the committee, and members of this room are ex-grammar school pupils. During the last decade, we had all the prime ministers, John Major, Margaret Thatcher, etc., were ex-grammar school pupils, and today we're in a place where fewer members of the civil service are from working class backgrounds than in the 1960s. So, does that still play a part? I mean, so Theresa May's government, were you Education Secretary when they tried to bring that up?
Yes, I was.
Okay. Right, there we are. They may already asked my question. I mean, how large a part do you think they still play in providing opportunity to people in various different parts of the country? Thank you.
It's a really, again, great question. So the answer is probably not a big enough role, actually, in the sense that they're not open enough to talent as I think they should be. And so you've almost got a series of schools that have become a slightly self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you look at house prices around grammars, then something that was set up to level the playing field so that anyone who made the grade, as it were, got a chance to go. And you can have a debate about whether that in itself was a good thing. But certainly in terms of if you were over that threshold, then you could go. The reality now is they're in a really, really different place. And so I think Britain's probably in a different place as well, because it was at a time when I think the attitude was there are some talented people in, if you like, the masses. As long as we can find them and then pull them up, then that's maybe the 1950s version of social mobility. I think now we need something much more ambitious. I'm talking about equality of opportunity. That means for everyone, not just some people. And so it's a broader challenge. And I think that's a different solution than just looking at grammars. But it's interesting you mentioned the civil service. I was actually the first education secretary that went to a comprehensive school, as you probably may know. That's maybe as much as anything a function of how the education system has changed over time. But I do think if you look at the civil service, like the point I made about the NHS, it needs to be more representative. And I thought it was fascinating listening to Helen McNamara, who was Deputy Cabinet Secretary, in other words, number 2 in the civil service, giving evidence to the COVID inquiry. And she basically said one of the challenges they faced was they didn't have that diversity of thought. There weren't enough people from enough different communities around the table to really get some of those decisions right. So, I thought that was, I think it sort of hits the nail on the head, really. And so the civil service has to change. And I guess what we're saying is, it is this million-piece jigsaw. We shouldn't get overly stressed about it, but it just means that each bit of the jigsaw has to think, right, how am I going to make my piece better? And one of those pieces is the civil service opening up to, a whole range of talent that perhaps it hasn't tended to draw on quite as much in the past, but could do.
So I'm going to slightly self-indulgently ask the next question. So you were also the Secretary of State for International Development. Now, that doesn't exist anymore because it's been put into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the budget for international development has been gutted by Boris Johnson. Now, although social mobility we think of in terms of a national issue, there's also an international, for humanity as a whole, there's an international issue at play. So do you think we, as Brits, do we think we have an obligation to spend that money to help others abroad and to put the same amount of effort that we do into social mobility at home, into social mobility abroad and helping people in foreign countries have the same opportunities?
I think it's much smarter to do that. I spent a lot of time going to, trouble spots around the world and refugee camps, and I really shaped our response, for example, to the Syria crisis when we saw, millions of people leave Syria. It was a middle-class country, a lot of us would recognise that society, we could relate to it. It had a good education system, and yet, because of the civil war there, effectively, people had to leave. So, I think they found themselves in refugee camps, and I think one of the things that you kind of never quite see on the TV is you get a sense of the sights and sounds, but you don't really get the smells and just that whole environment that people are in. And I met people who were in the middle of their education, middle of doing a degree in Damascus, and that was it. They were out, done, no more degree. They were living in a tent or living in a single room with a whole family. I think for people like that, lack of access to opportunity just increasingly becomes untenable to them. And they will do anything to try and get themselves into a better position where they can somehow get on with their lives. And that's what we see. And so on development, I can't think I ever met a single refugee that wanted to move. All of those camps were just outside Syria. They were just over the border in Jordan, just over the border in Lebanon. People wanted to go home. None of them were about to risk their lives because they had any other option. But it's our investment that helps give them the other options. And, so that international development effort was a smart thing to do. And I remember once saying to Nigel Farage that he had a pro-migration policy. Because my point to him was, where do you think these people are going to go if the refugee camp's not there? And actually what happened in Syria was, because the wider world didn't step up as much as it could or should have, what happened was those people that I met in those camps, they were there for literally 2-3 years, and then they just thought, well, we can't stay here forever. What are we going to do? And so we did have a window of opportunity to more effectively help them. And I'm really proud that Britain is still playing a role in doing that and has played a leading role. But actually, it's false economy in the end, because the amount, if you look at what happened in Germany, responding to 1 million, Syrian refugees, the amount spent once they arrived in Germany was dwarfed any amount that Germany would have ever invested in helping those same people be able to stay at home. So if the only thing that moves you is value for money, then value for money is working upstream in a wider world rather than waiting for it all to rock up on your doorstep and then getting upset about it and spending £8 million a day or whatever it is on hotels.
Thank you. Next question.
Good morning, Leonardo. So the question is, widening access was meant to a community and allow people to access university and research mission. what has happened is like people from maybe not very affluent areas, they get to university and instead of going back to the communities investing in it, they just move away. Living the original community probably not improving but living impoverished. So what do you think is a way to tackle this and maybe allow people that like improve their social status at universities to invest in their own communities rather than leaving them even more debilitated?
Yeah, and it's this tension, isn't it, between what an individual wants and thinks is best for them versus almost the system thinks. And I can relate to the question you just said because I'm from Rotherham, a very working class town. And yeah, Rotherham probably has lost its talent over the years. And it's what I mean when I say talent spread evenly, but opportunity is not. And you need to fix on both those things if you are going to change the system. So yes, you need to allow people a pathway on education, but it's not enough. You also need to be looking at how you can deliver that broader economic regeneration and opportunities on the doorstep for people to be able to think, actually, I might well have stayed in my region had there been more opportunity there. Maybe I'd have always spread my wings, but the bottom line is I didn't have a choice. And so I have spent all of my life since I left university away from my family. So I was right. I didn't get to see my mum and dad every day, like my mum did hers, because I had to leave to get the kind of opportunity I want. So it's more than one thing. I don't think you can stop people. I would never stop people going on in education, but I think that's necessary but not sufficient to tackle the challenges that we're talking about. And it's about choice for me. But I think if you create the right environment, then people will make choices that grow their communities. And we haven't talked about entrepreneurship, but I think allowing people to understand how to create their own opportunities for themselves, particularly in communities maybe where there is less economic activity. And yeah, maybe doing some incentives around them, doing that in places where we know those opportunities can really change lives. Yeah, I think those are the things that will start to nudge outcomes for the long term in a much better direction.
So, do 3 more questions. Josh.
Josh, actually.
You've been very patient, by the way.
Thank you so much. And it was a great address. Thank you so much. We agree on a lot, even though you're literally a Tory, which is really weird. Basically my question is, how do you get wealthy people to buy into the idea of social mobility beyond telling them that it will benefit them? Because Oxford and Cambridge have made conscious efforts to increase state school representation in their admissions. Private school kids are still disproportionately represented in those admissions, but all the Telegraph and the Daily Express can bang on about is how private school kids are like discriminated against. So they haven't, like wealthy people haven't bought into the idea of it so far. What can you tell them beyond it will benefit you in the future to get them to buy into the idea of it? Because to them, it is a zero-sum game. It might not be to you, but to them it's like a state school kid goes to Oxford or my kid goes to Oxford. They're going to prefer it to be their kid.
Yeah, and so there is a bit of this that just is, after a while, change just has to happen. Do you see what I mean? So I think there's an argument for why this is in everyone's interest. And I do want us to go together. But I remember maybe 10 years ago or so when I was Minister for Women and Equalities and I did the gender pay gap, and I talked to some male bosses of companies and they'd be like, well, you know, we did have a woman in that role, in a senior role, but then she left. And, well, we did have a senior role open up, but no women applied, as if it was all the women's fault. And it wasn't. It was down to how they led the business and the fact that it had been designed in a way that made it really hard for women to progress. So yes, there's a bit of it that is about coming on board, and I think it's a no-brainer that everyone's kids get more opportunities in a version of Britain where you get more talent unlocked. Like, more Steve Jobs equals better. So I think if people can't understand that, then there's only so far you can go to sort of explain it, but eventually you've just got to crack on, haven't you? People will come on board eventually, I'm absolutely sure.
Emma Phillips, John Snow. How much do you think the way someone speaks or their accent, or if they speak English as another language, affects their access to opportunities?
Well, it seems to, in the sense that if you look at some work by the Sutton Trust, I think it was out last year, they looked at accent and how that seemed to correlate to the ability to get opportunities. But I think it's probably just a good example of something that maybe over time we'll sort of look back on this and think it was a bit weird that somehow got in the way of assessing someone's potential to the extent that it did. I do remember, as a transport secretary, talking about HS2, as I said it, a Daily Mail columnist doing an entire column on how I said the letter H. And I just thought, well, frankly, it doesn't really, who cares? It was an utter irrelevance. The fact that it was a column, though, why was it a column? That was probably the real debate, is why there was a column printed on my accent. So, yeah, I mean, it's an issue, but again, I think it's just part of that sort of broader societal change that we need. This whole issue of received pronunciation. There's quite a lot of almost architecture there, isn't there, that sort of says, oh, you're not like this, you've got to be like that. Actually, we're all like we are. I mean, my version of how I talk is my version of how I talk. That's how we talk where I come from. It's not right, it's not wrong. It's fine. Other people talk differently. We're all talking English. So, yeah, I think it's about being smart, if we're stupid and we let things like that, in a sense, cloud our ability to see potential, then yeah, we won't do very well as a country. We'll be beaten by countries that are smart and get to the talent and don't let anything get in their way. That's what we should be like.
We'll have time to do 2 more questions.
Brendan and Sylvie, really nice to hear you, really nice. I had a question, and it's regarding a few things that you mentioned previous tonight. I get the idea that levelling up opportunities should be presented to individuals rather than something that should be sought after. So just to give a bit of context, I'm a mature student and I didn't have the opportunity to proceed to university when I was younger. I did an apprenticeship, and then during COVID I decided to apply to Durham, and even before that I faced some rejection. So my drive to start a degree was quite strong in comparison to someone that may be given the opportunity to come to a university based on characteristics or their background, where they grew up, for example. So I just wanted to know, do you think opportunity to level up should be given, or should it be sought after?
I think there's probably 2 bits to the answer. One is designing those really different pathways for very different people, and the fact that one size doesn't fit all, and making sure that there's genuine choice for people. And I think that we have had an education system where people have often been funneled down a more academic route, even when they wanted to do something more vocational, and possibly vice versa as well at times. So that's the first thing. So if you like, the architecture needs to be there for people to develop themselves in a way that plays to their strengths. The second thing then is getting the right advice and making sure that people can have informed choice, not just choice. And I think that is something probably that we can do a lot more focus on, and it's something that we can all actually help with. We can all be part of getting into schools and talking about our journeys, and the fact that often sometimes success is portrayed as a straight line where you do this and that worked and then you did that and that works, and that's not actually how life is. Life is quite circuitous at times. Life is, I tried this and it didn't work. So I had the courage and the resilience to go, I'll do something else. For employers, they want people who can get over challenges when they spotted them and who have the initiative to be able to say, that doesn't suit me, I'm going to do something else. That's what they're looking for. So actually giving advice, having choice, and then being able to show how you're navigating, I think, is the route forward. So it's a bit of both. It's a bit of showing people what's out there, and it's a bit of them, I think, having the initiative, as you did, to think, actually I want that opportunity over there, and that's what I'm going to go and try and get.
Okay, final question.
Ollie Rice at College of St Helens, St Bede. Given that the lack of social mobility is something that you described as a systemic problem and therefore requires long-term solutions that rarely realise tangible benefits in the short term, to what extent do you think this is something that has been sacrificed to the electoral cycle? And if that's the case, what in politics is ever going to change to resolve that?
I wouldn't say it's been sacrificed. I think it's just that in a democracy, inevitably, if you have a political system that feels it's there to deliver, to show the electorate it's delivered, it'll tend towards doing things that are more short-term. And I think that's why you need to have a much more collective effort on this and see it as a development challenge and set it in that space so that actually all the parties have got some solutions on this. Nobody's going to have a monopoly on being brilliant at levelling up or breaking down barriers. And in a sense, we've all got to get over those rosette colours to realise that, I work cross-party on this. And I would say there are super passionate people in every single political party. And the weird thing, going back to your question is, red team and blue team. Look at these parties. They were forged in an era where the debate was completely different, wasn't it? Back in an era where the class system was really entrenched, and there were people who owned and ran businesses, and there were people who were in businesses as workers, and who was representing them? And so you have this debate, and you end up with Labour and the Conservatives. That's not the debate we have today. And so you've ended up with this issue of equality of opportunity and net zero. It's just, they kind of don't translate onto those lines anymore. So you've got massive supporters of these big ticket issues all over the political spectrum. And I think it's been quite hard for us to get mobilised. And one of the reasons I stepped outside of Parliament, I just suddenly thought one day, this is mad. The fact that I'm a Conservative is stopping some other people working with me, and vice versa, which is bonkers. I got involved in politics because I thought it was how I would drive change. And I suddenly had to confront the fact that maybe on the issue I cared about the most, it was getting in the way of that. And so what was I going to do? And I just thought, well, if for me this is overriding as a sort of personal, is what I care about, what I want to have impact on, if politics is getting in the way, then I've got to somehow get out of that. And I'm enjoying working with some really different MPs from really different parties, and I hope, and I think it's true, but I hope that maybe getting them to come together might get them to think that there are some things in politics where we just need people to work together, and there's the other stuff where we can have a debate and it really matters, but then the political system now needs to deliver some long-term change, and it will need to think differently, particularly to the last, say, 10 years. Like the politics of division doesn't even go fast, let alone going far by going together. It's not achieving anything for Britain, is it? Because the problems we face are much more complex, and they require coalitions and consensus building and long-term solutions. And maybe that doesn't lend itself, like you say, to the electoral cycle. Maybe it doesn't lend itself to this more punch and judy politics that we have, but actually, in the end, any governance system has to deliver. And so if people want that system, they still want to be doing the debates and everything in the House of Commons, they are going to have to find a way to start delivering on this big ticket issue that actually, meanwhile, in the rest of the country, the one that we really care about. So that's why, you know, for your generation, I think you've been transformational on climate change. I really do. I think you should start to feel like you can be transformational on equality of opportunity as well, because that will mean it changes. The political system will respond to that if it's put at the top of the agenda.
So, a round of applause.